You know, when I read The God of Small Things 20 years ago, I still remember as a very vivid image the house with the river, the mangoes, and the butterflies that turned into dust. And now you have written this new book, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, which is as vivid as that, making new images and new pictures, I think, will live with at least me for 20 years to come. It's a book of both beauty and horror, of tenderness and cruelty, and it's woven together into a very complex narrative. And I would like to start by telling us the story of this book, because it's just only published, so people haven't read it or read about it. What is the story, and what is it about these persons, especially Anjum and Tilo in the book?
I think I'll not even try to tell the story.
It's the main
impossibility. But let me just maybe I can try and explain what I tried to do. Basically, after I wrote The God of Small Things, I was never, going to be that writer who sort of wrote a book, became famous, and then turned into a kind of novel writing factory, that had to produce a book every 2 years or something. I instead spent 20 years traveling and writing and arguing and deepening my own roots and understanding in India, which is a universe of its own. It lives in several centuries simultaneously. And I became somebody who, who had all these layers building up in me. And I thought, when I wrote The God of Small Things, I did have a tremendous sense of relief, because I finally found a language in which to be able to express myself. And that language wasn't just English. Actually, it was two languages. It was English and Malayalam together, the language that I grew up speaking. But when my universe became very much more complicated, the people in the ministry, basically, it was almost like they just started visiting me. They'd come and drop in, and then after a while, this whole gang just moved into my house and wouldn't go away. And I needed another language, and I almost felt like I had to take the language of the God of Small Things and throw it down from a very tall building and smash it and pick up the pieces, and that became The Ministry. Because The Ministry is a book in which I wanted to challenge what a novel can and should do. It was not enough for me to say, okay, a novel is a story in which you have a few characters and then you follow them, and maybe through them you have a political background. For me, it was like, can a novel be a city? Can a novel just be as complicated as one of the cities, like the city I grew up in? Can it have lanes and by-lanes? And can you just not look at a crowd and see a crowd, but stop and talk to the smallest person, smoke a cigarette with them, ask them where they came from, complicate things for the reader? Because it's not, I feel like writers are somehow being made into products, where everything is easy and you have this very beautifully integrated product. It fits on a shelf somewhere. You know the story, you know the subject, and so on. But this was, to me, to challenge how you tell a story. Can the background become the foreground? Can a really minor person suddenly become important? Can you make a reader deal with the kind of crowd that you have to deal with every day you step out onto the road, even if it frightens them? Can you make them trust you enough to say, okay, I'll get lost in this city, but I'm sure I'll find my way back.
Yeah, and you're an architect, because I think it's also somehow constructed like a house, or maybe a whole city, as you say. How does your work as an architect influence the way you write?
I think it influences the way I write tremendously, because to me, it's like when I was studying architecture, already by the time I was in my 4th and 5th year, I became very interested in cities and how they come to be what they are. Perhaps not a city like Copenhagen, but a city like Delhi, which is it's got this ancient part, and then it's got this this wild development. It breaks open 1857. After the mutiny, the British smash it. Then it forms itself. It's planned and it's unplanned, and it's modern and it's ancient. It's wild. It's poor. It's rich, and always it has a form that even in a city, all cities in the world sort of have a form that inscribe themselves against the contours of nature. And so, can you trust a novel to do that? Can you let it go and reel it back and let it go? And can it not be just entirely confected to be this thing where, so how can you balance those things and structure it? Because the structure of a novel, to me, is as important as the language and as important as the story, how the story reveals itself. So the chaos of the Ministry of Utmost Happiness is planned,
Yeah. There's also many borders in the book. Like Anjum, one of the main characters, live in a graveyard, like the border between life and death, and is also herself a hermaphrodite, like the gender border, and there's a border of Kashmir. So is the border like an important issue for you in the book?
Well, India, India is a country which the Western world looks at and thinks, oh, this is an anarchic place. Oh, it's, Bollywood and craziness, and you don't know what's going on. Actually, the anarchy is only in the traffic. The society itself lives in an iron grid of caste, of ethnicity, of religious. Any little move is a transgression that is met with death, even today. Maybe except amongst the very elite. So it wasn't that I set out to write a book in which, to me, a novel is something too beautiful to have a project or an issue. I mean, if I had to challenge borders or write about caste, I've done it in nonfiction. So for me, fiction is something too beautiful to be utilitarian. But perhaps because I myself am someone through whom borders run, because my mother was married outside of her community and whatever. So I find that, when I'm writing, I'm very inarticulate about what I'm writing. It's only afterwards I learn to talk about it and to think about it, and I realized then that all the characters in the ministry have these incendiary borders running through them. Not always what you think. Like you mentioned Anjum, she's actually born as Aftab in the old city of Delhi in the early 50s. And yes, she has the border of gender running through her. But today, the more dangerous identity that she has is that she's a Muslim in a place where Muslims are being slaughtered, ghettoized, killed. So Anjum, she actually finds herself in a state, the western state of Gujarat in 2002, where there was a massacre of Muslims that took place, where people were being literally slaughtered on the streets. And she escapes because she's a hijra, which is what people call the Urdu name for trans people of all kinds. And she escapes because the murderers feel that to kill her will bring them bad luck. So she thinks of herself as butcher's luck, you know. And when she comes back to her home in Old Delhi, she finds it hard to continue living her old life, haunted by the memories of what happened to the people there. And eventually she moves into the graveyard, just outside the walls of the old city. And for a long time lives there almost like a dead person. But then she slowly begins to recover. And she begins to initially build a home, and then she builds a guest house in the graveyard. It's called the Jannat guest house. Jannat in Urdu means paradise. And it's a guest house run in a graveyard, which becomes a sort of shelter for people. And again, you know, a lot of people in the West sometimes think now this is magic realism, but it's not, because remember that in India, the majority community are Hindu. They do not bury their dead. They cremate the dead. So graveyards are essentially Muslim. And now they are becoming ghettos because Muslims are being pushed out of the mainstream economically. And it's not just the killing. It's like they're not represented anymore. And so the graveyards are places where the poor do accumulate, you know. And then there is, of course, the other graveyard, which is in Kashmir, which is actually called Paradise. Jannat, Kashmir is often referred to as Jannat because it's such a beautiful place. And so in Delhi, you have a graveyard with the Jannat guest house, and in Kashmir, you have a Jannat that is now covered with graveyards because it has been occupied by the Indian Army since the 1990s, the most densely militarized zone in the world. And you know, as it says in the novel, that the gravestones grow out like young children's teeth.
Yeah, and I think also there's a lot of violence in the book, but it's not described. It's like the violence is usually taking place outside of the narrative, outside of the story. But it still works on us as readers. We see the violence very clearly, even though it's on second hand or seen through a certain angle. Do you think that this, how have you been thinking about describing violence in the book?
Well, I just feel that, you know, for me as a writer, the ambition is a simple one. It is that you have to be able to write about everything, you know, and you have to be able to you know, I don't want to write a beautiful book which is just which is just pitched at a very, let's say, a beautiful note, you know. But for me, it's important to be able to write about violence with the same intimacy with which I write about love. It's as important to be able to be utterly vulgar as it is to be exquisite, you know. And somehow that is how I experience life on the streets, you know. So often it's when I've been working with the translations, you know, because I was just talking to my translator about the fact that I mean, for me, in a way, living in a country where there are 780 languages and 22 official languages and 38 waiting to be made official, and all of us sort of swim around in a sea of languages. And so I write imagining many languages, you know. But say when you're translating this into Urdu, part of it is like going back home. And yet the idiom or the literary idiom of Urdu, as opposed to the spoken Urdu that you encounter on the streets are totally different, you know. So sometimes that violence or that vulgarity isn't there in the literary idiom, although it's there on the street.
Yes.
So how do you write about it, and how do you translate it, and how do you think about it? It's complex, but I think it's, you know, sometimes obviously it's more effective when you're not just writing something straight, but you're seeing it through a prism of something else, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. You made a film about the dam that you have been working against the construction of the big dam in Amada in India. And in that film you say that when you were a child, you were sitting on a boat on the river and looking down, waiting for the fish. And that experience is what made you a writer. And I'm curious to know, how do you think about that? How is it waiting for the fish from the depth to come to life in your mind, in your books?
Well, you know, I grew up obviously in the little village called Imanam, which is the setting of the god of small things. And again, partly because, you know, my parents were divorced and I was very young, I was 2 or 3, and to come back to that very traditional society where my mother was, it was really made very clear to her that she wasn't welcome there, and even more clear to us as very little children, my brother and me, that we were not welcome. And so in this strange limbo, we used to spend a lot of time on the river. And I suppose for children that young, to have that many hours of silence, unsupervised, patience, you know, probably has something to do with it. But I remember a very funny incident too, where one day when I went to the river, I must have been 5 or 6, and the woman who was my grandmother's older sister, who was actually baby Kochama in The God of Small Things, not a very pleasant character. So she came with me to the river, and she was making a nuisance of herself, you know, like making noise and talking to me, and it wasn't very good for fishing. And then I came back and I wrote a story, and it was called Fishing with My Ancestors, because I thought that ancestors were just your older relatives, you know, and she got so angry with me. She's like, ancestors are dead people, you know, you cannot call me an ancestor. But so it was, I'm sure, very much part of, you know, one's thinking.
Yeah, yeah. But about motherhood also, there's something about motherhood in the book. It's like it's taking away from the biological motherhood. Both Anjum and Tilo finds children that they take to them and becomes mothers for, and this becoming motherhood is very important. Anjum feels that her shattered body suddenly becomes whole, or her shattered self becomes whole, but in a motherhood that's not biological. I find that very interesting because it's many places in the book this takes place.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the book is full of babies, and it's Tilotama, the two main women characters, Tilo and Anjum. I've already introduced you to Anjum, and Tilotama, in some ways, she's a completely different character. Anjum is a raucous, generous, sheltering person, and Tilotama is a pretty steely, quiet character. I mean, she's designed as a person who lives inside the country of her own skin, and it's a country that issues no visas and has no consulates, and she's obviously can be a biological mother, but doesn't want to be one. And yet, it's not out of a lack of love, you know, but just a strangeness. I mean, she's got the edginess of you know, a person who, in fact, someone asks her, you know, like, why she doesn't get married, and she says she wants to be free to die alone and without explanation, So
Yeah.
she's a very, I think, unnerving character in many ways. And yet, both she and Anjum are women who are not obviously in any sense slogan, banner-carrying feminists, but they are so themselves that they are so obstinately, not even obstinately, they just are themselves. And so they're like water on rock, Eventually the rock has to wear down for them. And so through them, the book has very many ways in which you look at love or motherhood or friendship. In a way, the way I think of the connection between the ministry and the God of Small Things is that The God of Small Things is a book about a family which has a broken heart at its center. And the ministry is a book about people who start off with shattered hearts, and they bring those shards together to the graveyard and make a mended heart,
Yeah. Yeah, so it's a very positive, also amongst the violence, it's a very positive book. But also there's this thing about the gender. How many genders do you believe there is in the world?
I think gender is a spectrum and all of us are somewhere on it, because I think if you start counting, you'll always be leaving someone out,
Yeah. So
in the case of Anjum, and this is true in India, that there has always been a space for the hijras. It's a marginalized space, but it's a space. So it's a very organized community. And Anjum, when she turns 16, she moves from the house of her parents in the old city of Delhi into a home close by, and it's called the Khwabgah. In Urdu, Khwabgah means the house of dreams, where she lives in a community of people who have an infinite number of genders. There are men who just dress as women, there are people who have had surgery, there are all kinds of different kinds of people. And there are Hindus and Muslims and Christians, each with different ideas from their own religions of how. And they live together, and they refer to the outside world as the dunya, which means the world, And they somehow see themselves as somehow outside of the dunya.
Yeah. But you said the critic and writer John Berger had an influence on your writing. Will you tell about that? Or this book, how it started?
Oh, well, John Berger was for me, a very beloved writer and friend. And when I was with him in his village one day, he just said, "Okay, now, open your computer and read me what you're writing," which is not something that anybody could easily say to me, And then I said, okay, and I started reading from the book. I had already started writing. This was many, many years ago, and and I already knew that it was going to be called The Ministry of Utmost Happiness. So he used to call me Utmost. And he said, "I want you to promise me that you go back to India and you will not do anything else but write this book. It's the most important thing you can do." So I said, "I promise." And I went back to India, and within 2 weeks of my being back, a note was slipped under my door, and it was from the guerrillas in the forest fighting a battle against these huge mining companies, asking me to come, which is not something that they do to anybody. So I instantly broke my promise to John, and I went into the forest, and I lived there with them for a few weeks, and I came out and wrote a big little booklet actually called Walking with the Comrades. But it turns out that there's a very important character who I met. I mean, not literally, but I'm saying, one of the characters that came to meet me, who is in the book, is from there, you know. So she, so maybe I was writing the book in the way I promised him I would. But I was just taking a circuitous route to it.
Would you say your characters, they arrived at your house in your mind and start living there?
Yeah, first they just sort of used to drop in and, then the visits began to last long, and then they just shamelessly moved in with me. And I used to have this feeling that, people think I live alone, but they see the crowd, And the minute, and for many years when I was writing, if anyone came to see me, the only thing that would go on in my head was, be normal. Just don't act as if you're, needing to be institutionalized. So, and the minute they would leave, all these characters would immediately begin to discuss them, who had come, what they were like. So that's why I keep saying, people, especially last year when the book came out, and everybody, obviously, you have to go through that 1 year where everybody has an opinion about it. I was saying, yeah, but they have an opinion about you too.
And I think they also had an opinion on your publishers.
They had an opinion on my publisher, yeah. Basically, I'm a incurable loyalist, so all the publishers who published The God of Small Things obviously got this. But in Germany, my publisher had died, so I didn't have a publisher. So my agent, whatever, I had to go to Germany, and there was a day in which I had to meet a number of publishers who had already written letters to me saying what they thought of the book and all that, and they'd already made whatever offers they had to make. And I wanted to meet them. And then, I was supposed to decide. So so my agent said, well, decide. So I said, well, I have to talk to some folks. So he says, you talk to me, sunshine. I'm your agent. I said, no, I need to talk with Anjum and Tilo and all of them and ask them. And then I said, well, they want Hans Jürgen. So these agents, the blood drained from their face, because they said, but his offer is like half of everyone else's. So how is that possible? I said, that's what it's going to be, because they like him, So anyway, so then eventually they went and told him that, well, look, I don't know what's wrong with her, but this is the thing. And then he said, oh, we'll double it. So I said, so I had it both ways,
But how does it work when you write, actually? I mean, you say they're in your house, you hear them, you talk to them, but from there to the writing, what is the process? How is your day, your writing day, when you do sit down and write? Or I guess you sit down.
Well, I don't know, I mean, you're a writer, and you know how obsessive it is, right? I mean, you're writing all the time. You're walking, you're writing, you're buying vegetables, you're writing, you're burning the food on the stove, you're writing. So I'm not someone who only writes like that, So in fact, people sometimes think that it's arrogance when I say that I don't make a whole lot of drafts. But it's just that the drafting goes on in my head. So when I actually write, it's not that I generate volumes and then edit it. And everything does have a place, and I know why it has that place, you know. Every word, every sentence, every chapter, whatever, it does. But eventually, I think the fundamental art is to concentrate, right? And then somehow it appears on the page, but to concentrate, to be able to be open to allowing it to happen, to allowing the characters to speak without getting in the way, you know.
Yeah, you have also said that writing to you is the closest you come to prayer.
Yes,
Yeah.
writing a novel to
Is
me.
that the openness to let something come and...
No, and also the thing is that to me, if anyone was to say, what do you feel most grateful for in your life? I would say that I feel most grateful for having been able to, on 2 occasions at least, lavish all my concentration and my love and my skills and on something that I was able to mold into what I wanted it to be, which is separate from what other people think about it, but it's what I wanted it to be, you know?
Yeah. There's something I didn't understand first in the book, but which I then later understood was really important. It's the people who transport cattle, dead cattle, but then are stopped. I wonder if you will explain that whole, why is it so important about the cattle and the dead cattle in the book?
Well, basically it's about caste, you know, and so the upper caste Hindus believe that even the farmers, even people who are farmers, they believe that once a cow has died, it becomes polluted. And so that's why the Hindu caste system has the outcasts, who are now called Dalits, who transport the dead cow, and then they are the skinners who skin it and make leather goods and so on. But also Muslims who are cattle growers who also eat beef and so on. So in the book, and in India today, almost every day you're reading about the Hindu right, which is now in power in a big way. They lynch people, they beat people to death, accusing them of either eating beef or having killed cows, you know. And it's a manifestation of the rise of the Hindu right, and in fact, when I leave here, I'm going to be speaking. I'm going to be doing the Sebal lecture, and I'm talking about the fact that this thing of lynching people and killing people, it's called Gauraksha, which means cow protection, and it began in post-1857, at the turn of the century, when the Hindu community, which all of you and all of us think of as an ancient religion, actually Hindu was the word that the Muslims and the British used to describe people who lived east of the Indus. Hindus never call themselves Hindus. They only call themselves by their caste name. I'm a Brahmin, I'm a Jat, I'm a Gujar, I'm a Baniya, you know. And Hindu is actually a political constituency. And when that constituency began to form itself post the mutiny of 1857, when the Muslim, the last Mughal emperor was deposed, and suddenly there was a vacuum, and there was a jostling for favor with the British administration. And this constituency now began to form itself and petition the British for representation. And that is when the Hindu community formed itself, and it needed some cultural markers to mark itself off from other constituencies. And one of the cultural markers was this cow protection, you know. So it began actually, I mean, the cow vigilantes of today have a history that goes back 150 years, which is why I keep saying what's going on in India is not Donald Trump. It's something that has a long history. It's been coming a long time. It's not a cartoon show.
Yeah. But you also have some challenges sometimes when you do reading. This is a very nice audience, but maybe you will tell this audience how it sometimes is for you when you do readings or talks.
Well, especially because of my position on these things and the things that I say about Kashmir, there are vigilante groups who have sort of taken an oath that no meeting of mine can ever go uninterrupted, so they often chant Arundhati Roy Gaddar hai, Pakistan ka yaar hai, which means, Arundhati Roy is a traitor and she's not this person who's like supporting the army and she's a friend of Pakistan and so on. So yeah, there have been occasions when I'm speaking in a place like this and suddenly they come and smash up the stage and smash everything and start, raising slogans against me. And so normally when I'm speaking, I have eyes behind my head too.
Yeah. But you have chosen not to have protection.
Look, you can't have protection, the protection has to be political. And I'm not alone. There are many people. I'm not a heroine. I'm not longing to be a martyr. I'm not wanting to capitalize on the fact that, I'm such a threatened person. Because many of us are threatened, and we can continue to do what we do. We do it strategically. We do it carefully. But I don't want to make capital out of this, I'm such a superstar. It's not like that. And see, if these people want to get to you, they'll get to you, So, I don't think that security, it just attracts attention. And it's not, see, it's a very dangerous place. And a lot of people are and have been killed, shot, assassinated. But there's often there are people who are going after a particular industrialist or exposing a particular corruption scandal or talking about a particular caste for whatever reason. Whereas that's not what I do, I'm telling a story it's not journalistic, or it's not an expose of anyone or an individual. It's different.
Yeah, I think
However, people are, writers are threatened, novelists are threatened, all of that does happen.
Yeah, but I think you have given us a lot of knowledge about modern India in this book. It's a wonderful story, but it's also enlightening to know what's going on. And I wonder if you should end this talk by reading a small chapter from it.
So I'll read. I'm going to read from chapter 3. It's called the Nativity, and it's really the part. I was actually this whole novel I started thinking about because I was actually in this place, and this little baby did appear. So it was the sort of spark that set off this ministry of utmost happiness. It was peacetime, or so they said. All morning, a hot wind had whipped through the city streets, driving sheets of grit, soda bottle caps, and beady stubs before it, smacking them into car windscreens and cyclists' eyes. When the wind died, the sun, already high in the sky, burned through the haze, and once again the heat rose and shimmered on the streets like a belly dancer. People waited for the thunder shower that always followed a dust storm, but it never came. Fire raged through a swathe of huts huddled together on the river bank, gutting more than 2,000 in an instant. Still the amalthas bloomed, a brilliant, defiant yellow. Each blazing summer it reached up and whispered to the hot brown sky, "Fuck you." She appeared quite suddenly, a little after midnight. No angels sang, no wise men brought gifts, but a million stars rose in the east to herald her arrival. One moment she wasn't there, and the next, there she was on the concrete pavement in a crib of litter, silver cigarette foil, a few plastic bags, and empty packets of Uncle Chips. She lay in a pool of light under a column of swarming, neon-lit mosquitoes, naked. Her skin was blue-black, sleek as a baby seal's. She was wide awake, but perfectly quiet, unusual for someone so tiny. Perhaps in those first short months of her life, she had already learned that tears, her tears at least, were futile. A thin white horse tethered to the railing, a small dog with mange, a concrete-colored garden lizard, 2 palm-striped squirrels who should have been asleep, and from her hidden perch, a she-spider with a swollen egg sac watched over her. Other than that, she seemed to be utterly alone. Around her, the city sprawled for miles. 1,000-year-old sorceress, dozing but not asleep, even at this hour. Gray flyovers snaked out of her Medusa skull, tangling and untangling under the yellow sodium haze. Sleeping bodies of homeless people lined their high, narrow pavements, head to toe, head to toe, head to toe, looping into the distance. Old secrets were folded into the furrows of her loose parchment skin. Each wrinkle was a street, each street a carnival, each arthritic joint a crumbling amphitheater where stories of love and madness, stupidity, delight, and unspeakable cruelty had been played out for centuries. But this was to be the dawn of her resurrection. Her new masters wanted to hide her knobby varicose veins under imported fishnet stockings, cram her withered tits into saucy padded bras, and jam her aching feet into pointed high-heeled shoes. They wanted her to swing her stiff old hips and reroute the edges of her grimace upwards into a frozen, empty smile. It was the summer grandma became a whore. She was supposed to become the super capital of the world's favorite new superpower. India, India, the chant had gone up on TV shows, on music videos, in foreign newspapers and magazines, at business conferences and weapons fairs, at economic conclaves and environmental summits, at book festivals and beauty contests. India, India, India. Thank you. Thank you.